Go ahead. No, go ahead.
So for third parties, the way third parties are still subject to the Federal Trade Commission's jurisdiction, which enforces against unfair, deceptive trade practices. And the Commission interprets that very broadly. There have been enforcement actions against, I'm trying to think, Sears, for example, for not providing notice of secondary uses of information. I mean, there was notice, it was hidden somewhere in terms and conditions. There was another case very recent, but I don't remember the name. So the FTC is doing it. The problem is that there are only a couple of cases. So for the most part, the FTC's expectation is that the industry will look at these enforcement actions and fall in line itself. So it's sort of like a self-policing mechanism. But the FTC has said that if they monitor the level of compliance and they don't believe it's adequate, they increase their enforcement activity. So take it for what it is. The enforcement climate is not, I mean, I don't want to say it's not great. Depending who you are. If you're a consumer, it's not great. If you're in the industry, you have some leeway.
And the average customer is not going to know to call the FTC.
Right.
They'll call the utility.
Yeah.
And right.
Chris, go ahead.
So, Chris Villarreal, excuse me, with the California Public Utilities Commission. Mike asked, part of the question I'm going to ask is who's going to be the enforcer of third parties? It's my personal opinion that while the FTC may be the more appropriate one, the more likely person will be the state attorney generals, because the state laws are likely to be more restrictive than the federal laws. And as a result, we have the patchwork of 50 states. I'm sure several of you are familiar with GainesvilleGreen.com. The city of Gainesville is a municipal utility in the state of Florida. There is practically no limits on, or there's no protection on privacy of utility bills. So if you go to GainesvilleGreen.com, you go there, they have a Google map, and you can look at everyone's house in the city of Gainesville, what their last year's electric, water, gas bills were per month, when the house was built, so they match the data from the utility with the data coming off of Zillow. So they know what year the house is, the square footage of the house, and this is done to encourage energy efficiency. So how do we start balancing the need for privacy coupled with the need to do certain policies that are implemented by state regulatory authorities, such as encouraging energy efficiency? Where do we keep the balance? Now, I say that because you criticized the initial Colorado rulemaking, and from my perspective, I kind of like the initial rules that the Colorado PUC offered. So I'm just trying to get a feel for what you guys think about how to balance two very important yet seemingly inconsistent positions.
I think it's a real challenge, and I'll say to you that as a utility that gets requests for data all the time from governmental entities who want to promote conservation, we oftentimes are sitting there trying to figure out how to sort through that. How do you serve the public purpose, which we agree with, which is conservation and improving the environment, and still maintain the privacy of the individual, particularly where we're a single source for that data. If you really want to benchmark and measure conservation, energy efficiency, carbon, et cetera, you need to be able to get a very good data set of where you are starting and then measure your progress. So, you know, you can go to each individual customer within a geographic location, ask for their consent, and based on their response rate, you may not have a very good data set. So you go to the utility and you ask for the information to be given directly to the entity so that they can do that measurement. I'll give you some examples. We had a municipal entity that asked us to give them the individual usage of all residents within that municipality so that they could put signs in the yards of their residents who were particularly energy efficient.
That's kind of the things I was concerned about from a customer protection is that.
Well, we said no.
Right, so if you have a group that is encouraging energy efficiency and they're getting people's data that aren't doing energy efficiency, then you have, I used to call it Scarlet A, but you're probably not getting a Scarlet A, you used to get a green G in your front lawn.
It's sort of the reverse shaming. And so one of the things you look at is, okay, well, here's an entity, a governmental entity, municipal entity, that very much wants to promote very good public policy, right? So how do we do that? then it's become, okay, well, we've said we can give them aggregated information. And so they want it aggregated at a level to where they can compare literally block to block or neighborhood to neighborhood, and to be able to use that to encourage people to conserve. And they talk about the fact that they would like to be able to let people know and hopefully inspire some competitiveness, that their neighborhood is not as good as the one next door, their block is not as good as the one next door. I understand where they're coming from, and I applaud that they've taken this on as a significant goal for that area, but at the same time, I will be the one that will be dealing with the calls from the customers if they're not happy that their information was identifiable, or at least very, very closely identifiable. I think one of the things, and I'd put the question back to you, is we've been looking at what is sufficiently anonymous and aggregated data. We've been looking to PG&E and some of the utilities in California that use the 15-15 rule, and wondering, is that a workable solution for us to try and get that aggregation down at a level that's fairly detailed for, you know, some of the people who are requesting it, but still maintaining customer privacy. I haven't been able to find a fan of the 15-15 rule. Are you a fan?
Chris, you can plead the fifth if you want.
The camera is still on, I believe. Again, my personal opinion is I am not a fan of the 15-15 rule. I would prefer all those choices being left to the consumer and less to the utility.
But faced with a situation where you're given a request, what I struggle with is a definition of aggregated data that's the same as pornography. I'll know it when I see it. I can't put that in a tariff, and I can't give that definition as a reason for not providing data when I get a request from someone like a municipal entity or another governmental entity who's trying to move forward a very public purpose, right? Mm-hmm. I can't say, oh, I'm sorry, in my infinite wisdom, as the data privacy czar, you are not going to have this data. You know, so trying to define what is a reasonable level is just been maddening.
So I won't take Ward's point, but I just want to make two other points. One, having gone through the throes of creating a proceeding to do privacy, hopefully we'll have our decision out sometime this month. I don't know how useful it will be to your proceeding, but we'll have something out this month. And two, I'm guessing most of us have also seen the Purdue graduate student who issued her report about calling 100 utilities and asking them, do you have smart meters, what's your privacy policy, and getting roughly a 30% response rate from the first call. And so there is a lot of training that still needs to go on by our utilities to do privacy. So I'll go ahead and step aside.
Ward, go for it.
Wow, I have to follow the utility bash. Ward Pyle, Southern Company, if anyone didn't know that. One of my questions is a problem that we continually run into right now in privacy considerations is the misconception that the utility has the desire at all to do readings every 15 minutes and actually have a mapping of what all is going in the home. That's more of a perceived understanding that's been developed by government and requests from FTC and others around what is possible to provide the different government programs. One of the big pieces there as well is external third parties and how they're involved in understanding that and wanting that type of data from us. And so I'm interested to hear what everyone has to say about how it's being requested and then the force of nature that's currently going on around policy for utility entities to provide this data externally, not necessarily within our will or interest, because it's not necessarily the customer that's desiring that in all aspects.
Prior to even getting that far, I think both a utility and a third party and a consumer need to answer the question of what is real time. Because from a meter, going back to a utility, to be able to push a button and say, I want a meter reading now, and I want a meter reading now, and I want a meter reading now, that's not going to happen. So real time possibly to a utility is anywhere from 15 minutes to 12 hours, you know, depending upon the reading that they get. From a third party that's running across the internet, yeah, it's the speed of the bandwidth. And to a consumer, it's, I push that button, I want that information within 30 seconds, and 30 seconds is even long. So defining what real time is first before asking what type of information, I think is a key in coming from each one of those parties. So to start and then,
You know, I think, you know, one of the things that is been part of the debate in the Colorado rulemaking are parties to that proceeding who certainly want to have access to the customer's meter information in real time. Real time being defined what they think our meters can do.
Real enough time.
And, you know, one of the things that I think is challenging there is, okay, so first of all, there's an assumption that the utility has the ability to deliver that. And going to your question, which is, you know, utilities really, they're in the business of delivering electric service. They're not in the business of providing data. They're being dragged into a quasi-data services proposition here because they're single source for the information as well in a lot of regards. And if you want to further public policy, people keep coming to you to be able to get that information. Welcome to my world. You know, it is a challenge there because even with consent, we still have to protect security. So even if the customer says, hey, yeah, real-time access, no problem, have that, I'm not so sure I understand all of the security implications from that. I don't know that we have all the technology and functionality necessary to deliver that in a safe and secure manner. And I'd like to know who will pay for that when I put that in. Is that going to be borne by my customer base as a cost of service, or is that going to be borne by the cost causer? And that is a raging debate as well.
So just to add to that, I think that if you might be compelled to share information with the government or third parties, but with the government, I suppose you have no choice. But in any case, you have to understand what the risks are. So if you're sharing, let's take a third party that's operating a terminal, the home air network terminal. They might get their own information from the appliances, but they want to combine it with smart meter information. So they'll come to you and they ask for that information. So even if you're compelled to share the information with that third party, you still have to understand what your risks are. You have to make sure that it's a legitimate third party, that you're not going to incur liability for sharing that information. So thinking about it in terms of liability and having appropriate contractual framework in sharing information is also important to protect the utilities. Even if you're compelled to share the information, you still have to think about those risks.
Well, it is now 10:45, which is the point at which I was supposed to open the floor up to questions, but we've already blown that off the rails, so go ahead.
I'm Jacek with Vermont Electric Co-ops. I'm on the utility side, a smaller scale. First of all, I fully agree that the educational aspect of AMI deployment is very important. It's so far, well, I see that the biggest problem with AMI deployment are created by insufficient education with the consumer. And AMI is not only to read the interval data, but also with many other services like improve the outage management system, avoid high usage bills, which is a very common problem with the utility. But my question is a little bit different. From time to time, I hear the question about who owns the data, interval data. And I hear the different answers, different opinions. I'm on the technical side, I'm not a lawyer at all, but I'm guessing that the answer to this question has the implication to many other aspects of the whole process. So I'm just wondering what's the opinion with Colorado, Ohio, other states, what's going on?
In the request for information submitted by the Department of Energy, there was a lot of talk about who owns the data, and Xcel Energy said publicly that we believe we do, and that position for us has not changed. The DOE's report punted the issue and basically said, well, regardless of who owns it, there are rights of access, and there are rights to limit access, irrespective of who owns it. Colorado rulemaking is not probably wisely taking on the decision of who owns the data at this point. They're looking at it from the perspective of access. What kind of access should the customer have? What kind of access should third parties have? What are the logistical things that have to be in place to make that access happen and to protect privacy so the information does not become public. I think the debate on ownership is not easily resolved. I have heard very good arguments for the utility owning the data. I've made some of them. I've heard very good arguments for the customer owning the data. And I've had some people who, like Solomon, split the baby and say there's some sort of co-ownership here.
I figured I'd better let the lawyer take a swing at that one.
I will be fairly blunt. I agree with this. I would just say that who owns the data, ownership is a term of art. When we say who owns the data, we're really asking who has the right to preclude others from using the data. That's really the issue. If you look at privacy laws in the United States, none of them answer the question who owns the data. It's all about who can use the data and under what circumstances. And I think that's also the relevant question here, and not the ownership, because the ownership implies the right to exclude, and we're sort of divorcing those concepts. So I think the DOA did the right thing to not focus on that, but talk about use, and or you can frame it as the right to access the data. And multiple parties will have that access. And think about your daily life. There's a lot of information about you, the consumer, but do you own it? No, everybody has it, and everybody can access it under different sort of legal frameworks.
I think that's why in a lot of the discussions you start to hear not so much the question of who owns the data, but who is the data about and who is the custodian of the data.
Right.
Who's the agent?
There is a concept of data ownership, let's say under state breach laws, breach notification laws. It says that the data owner has the obligation to notify, but it doesn't mean the data owner. It means that the principal, the company that has the data, let's say if the utility has the data about its customers, and it suffers an information security breach, it has the responsibility to notify, because it's under those laws, it's the data owner. But
it's the entity that's maintaining the data.
Right, on its own behalf, not on behalf of another entity. So.